Hi, it's Jeff here, and this is a review of the communication module for ENG 1101. Now, we've had a few lectures on engineering communications, and I'm going to walk through them here to help you prepare for the quiz that's coming up. First lecture we had was on an introduction to communication. Then we talked about engineering arguments. Then we talked about ethical communication a little bit briefly. We talked a great deal about rhetorical argument, and then we ended with presentations, storytelling, and pitching. In our introductory lesson, we looked at a radio transmission model, or the Shannon-Weaver model of communication. And in this model, we have a message that's central, that's being transmitted from a sender to a receiver. Now, noise is possible on either end and can obstruct this communication. Another important point about this model is feedback going from the receiver back to the sender. This can come in many different ways, and I'll let you brainstorm what those might be. And then we looked into axioms of communication. These are fundamentals that underscore how we understand communication. There's 9 of them, and these axioms state that communication is an interaction. There's an element of relation. Communication takes place in a context. We establish credibility by communicating. Communicating is a means through which we gain influence. Communication involves an amount of risk. Communication can be ambiguous. Effective communication is audience-centered, and communication is pervasive. That last one's a bit tricky. You know, often we try not to communicate with each other, but simply by not trying to communicate, we send a message to the person that we're not interested in them or what they have to say. Now, as a study tip, I suggest rather than just memorizing these 9 forms, you go through each one systematically and think of an example of a particular situation that you have encountered in life, and think of how this example demonstrates that axiom of communication. In the next lecture, we looked at engineering arguments. These often occur in written forms of communication, and we broke down that structure to something that consists of grounds, claim, justification, evidence, and perhaps a qualifier or a rebuttal. Central to this model is the claim, justification, and evidence. Often people in their writing omit the evidence, and we end up with a weak argument where there's no data or no reasons to back up the claims that are made. Here's an example of an argument. This one says that Ehab has missed more than half his rugby practices in the past 2 weeks. In the last game, he failed to catch 5 easy passes. Therefore, Coach Aaron should bench Ehab because his performance has declined. If we look at this argument and we want to identify where the claim is located, we can look for this, and we'll see that this claim here is in the last sentence. In other words, the paragraph builds up to the claim. Now we can improve this paragraph and make it more clear by putting that claim at the beginning of the paragraph in a clear topic sentence. Here's an example of a better version of that argument. Coach Aaron should bench Ehab, that's the claim at the start, at his next rugby game because his performance has declined. Ehab has missed more than half his rugby practices in the past 2 weeks, and in the last game he failed to catch 5 passes. We can enhance this argument and make it even better by adding a qualifier to that paragraph. So we can add on, however, since Ehab knows the plays, he should be kept as a reserve in case other players are injured. Now we're setting a limitation of when that argument applies and when it doesn't. Expanding on the scope of written communication, we can look at the different purposes of written reports. A report might analyze something, might make a recommendation, and that's where rhetoric is quite important. Or a report may be intending to control something. We also want to make sure we understand the reader, understanding who is the audience, but what do we want the reader to do with the report or the form of communication that we're presenting to them. Have we made this clear? In the next lecture, we went on to look at ethical communications. And we talked about how it can be unethical to mislead or misrepresent data. There's several reasons here on the slide, and you can review these at your leisure. We talked a fair bit about plagiarism. We looked at examples and talked about effective paraphrasing. And you also had a tutorial that focused on this issue. We talked about ways of avoiding plagiarism. And it really comes down to make sure you give credit for ideas that aren't yours. The next topic we looked at was rhetoric, ethos, pathos, and logos, and how we can use these to convince others of our point of view. As a study tip, I suggest trying to find some persuasive speeches or some persuasive writing and deconstruct that arguments to identify all the different forms of rhetorical argument. So identify what language in this passage suggests that ethos is being established. What language is being used to show that logos is being used. Ethos can be established by the credibility of the messenger, the tone and style, and the way the messenger refers to other points of view. So if we have a piece of writing and we're trying to say that ethos is being used, we'll look for language in that paragraph that shows one of these three things, and therefore conclude that the writer is establishing ethos. We looked at some examples in class, underlining specific words and phrases that showed the credibility, or showed the tone and style, or showed how other points of view are addressed. I suggest going through these if you're not sure what ethos means. In the quiz, you should be able to replicate this type of exercise. Logos is the logic of the argument. So using structures that are familiar, using facts and data, predicting counter-arguments and addressing those counter-arguments so that your point of view seems very logical. We did an exercise in class where you tried to predict counter-arguments for people who might disagree with you and addressed those counter-arguments head-on. Here's some tips about logos, and this is regarding transitional words. Transitional words are cue to the reader or cue to the audience on what you're about to do next. This makes the logic of whatever you're saying flow very easily. The final form of rhetorical argument, is pathos. Pathos can come from an emotional appeal, an appeal to self-interest, or an appeal to lack of self-interest, or an appeal to identity, so an association with a group, a cause, and so on. To do this effectively, we need to understand who the audience is, what their point of view is, what they might care about, what their identity might be, and that way we can target our message to appeal to that. For example, you might want to look at the Man on the Moon speech by President J.F. Kennedy from the 1960s. See if you can identify different ways in which he used pathos to convince Americans that they should invest in sending a human to the moon and back. In the next lecture, we talked about presentations, the importance of making eye contact. Remember, this is feedback in the Shannon-Weaver transmission model. We talked about using hand gestures, having body language that's engaging with the audience. And we talked about the importance of free lecturing, not simply reading from a prepared speech. And importantly, show enthusiasm. Now, as a reflection, think about how well you did this when you gave your group presentation. Next time you give a presentation, how might you improve on your presentation style? Presentation is also about the voice quality. So be sure to speak loudly, avoid talking monotonously, and be aware of the surroundings you're in. Again, know your audience. This keeps coming up time and time again. Know who you're communicating to and tailor your communication or your presentation to that audience. We talked about storytelling as a method of presenting. Now, storytelling is more than just sharing information or sharing an experience. Storytelling has a structure to it. All stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and characters within the story that have specific roles and specific purposes. So storytelling recalls experiences, but with meaning woven throughout the story. Storytelling can be a really compelling form of communication. Or in other words, it provides order to the chaos in life. There's a lot of information on these slides about the human needs for stories. To make sure you understand these, I suggest you take this information and see if you can describe it in your own words. Lastly, we talked about pitching, and you may commonly use pitching to make a sale, spread an idea, gain an investment. We looked at some pitches from websites such as Kickstarter, and we deconstructed those pitches to identify how Ethos, Logos, and Pathos was used. You might also deconstruct a pitch from the point of view of an engineering argument. Can you identify the claims? How are the claims being justified? What evidence is the communicator using to back up the claim? Good luck studying for the next quiz. Hopefully this review has been useful, and we'll see you in class. Bye.